And second?
I'll second it.
Okay, all in favor? I'm assuming it's a yes. If there's a nay, please say so. All right, so we're going to move right into workshop. And looks like we have a full board. Welcome, everybody, and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Let's see. Andrew, are you going to walk us through these or Rod?
It's a combination of both of us. I think Rod will handle waivers and I'll handle all the rest. I think I might start with the easiest and move to the hardest, I think, from my perspective. In your packet, I prepared 3 memos. Rod prepared a 4th for these 4 topics. The first that I think we should talk about is the blasting permit threshold issue. So back a month, 6 weeks ago, we came to you and said, we think that there might be an opportunity for us to improve or at least make it a little bit easier for you all not to review all of the blasting permits. We've gotten a number of non-annual blasting permits this year. At our last meeting, after we kind of looked at the actual draft language, the threshold that we had discussed at the prior meeting of 1,000 yards seemed to be a little bit too high. And what I heard from you all was, well, what are the sizes of the ones that we've reviewed and approved in the past, and how many have we done? So did a little investigation work into the last 5 years of blasting permits that the planning board has issued. So these are ones that are over 300 yards and that are not the annual type of permit. The memo in your packet indicates that, we've had a total of 5 of these in the last 5 years. So that initial concern that or opportunity that we thought that we had, from my perspective, at least, I kind of feel like maybe there's really not a big lift for the planning board right now. Maybe we keep things as is. That being said, we've also identified some other improvements, and Dan submitted some comments on the draft text yesterday. Especially considering, I think one of the really great comments that I read in there was about projects that go through some amount of site plan approval or subdivision approval. Maybe those do not need to come back to the board for approval. But it's really the board's discretion as to whether or not you want to move forward on this issue or this proposal or not. Again, there were just 5 in the last 5 years.
So I wasn't in the last discussion. Does anyone wish to make any comments? All right. I guess my thought would be 5 doesn't exactly make me think that it's a real burden to the planning board. So I probably wouldn't go forward. However, if there's some valid things we should look at as far as the ordinance, maybe we should do that, right? So it's really taking a different tact anyway, but I guess I'll leave that to the board. Is there interest in pursuing this year? I assume any changes we'd make would have to go through the full process, including town meeting.
I don't think changing it is really worthwhile. That 5 in 5 years is not overly burdensome. And I assume somebody can get in fairly quickly if they need to blast more than the 300 yards. So I'm happy leaving the way it is.
Okay. Any other thoughts? If not, I think we can move on.
Yeah, I'm happy to move on.
All right.
Yep.
So we can move on. So number 2.
Let's talk about the use table. So our use table, which is an attachment to the ordinance, is what identifies which uses are allowable or permissible in which districts. And in my memo here, we've kind of identified a couple of levels of effort, and we're certainly going to take advantage of the first level of effort. So the first is just a simple reformat of the table. Right now, the document is just hard to read. There's no, lines that help us line up where the use is with which district it is. The districts are out of order when it comes to intensity, or at least grouping them by type of district. So that simple reformatting is something that we are underway on. And in fact, in your packet, the document, that little spreadsheet that had the yellow blocks on it. It was that kind of initial effort to just translate the existing one into a new document. That reformatting is clerical. We're not going to be changing any of the actual content of the table. That's just a usability issue. So that's something that we can do outside of the town meeting amendment process. So the next one, and we talked about this briefly about 6 weeks ago, is to start categorizing uses. And I've provided a more specific example for you all to kind of look at and think about. We tracked down a pretty great use table from Peoria, Illinois, though a lot of the more modern use tables are very similar to this. It categorizes uses. So as in my memo, I have kind of an example. We have, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 industrial-like uses right now in our table. And the proposal would be to group all those into the big category of industrial uses, and then have kind of subcategories that are a little bit more specific. So in the example, industrial is the broad category, and those subcategories are things like wholesale trade, light industrial, warehouse and distribution, heavy industrial, energy, and waste-related services. Those are categories that Peoria had. We can certainly change. We can do whatever we want to when it comes to these categories. But the basic idea is gather the ones that are very similar together, and then identify or at least define each one of these subcategories so that when a new use comes in off the street, someone wants to develop something that isn't explicitly in our table, the code enforcement officer can look to this table and say, well, it isn't exactly food processing, but it's very similar to. And so the catch-all of light industrial uses other than below is where that use would then be permissible. And what that allows us to do is be more responsive to new uses. So people that come in with ideas that we didn't consider as we've written our ordinance over the last 40 years, instead of having to wait a whole year or year and a half in order to bring a proposal to town meeting, this would allow the code enforcement officer to figure out what's the best fit. That doesn't necessarily mean that he has to say that it's permissible. And in fact, he could deny it and say, it doesn't fit. It doesn't even fit one of these subcategories. And the applicant could then choose to maybe perhaps appeal that opinion to the appeal authority, however that's defined. Maybe it's the planning board, maybe it's the zoning board of appeals.
So Andrew, are we having issues now with the use table? And is the codes officer looking for us to do something with this?
Rod, jump in here, but I don't. There certainly we haven't even gotten to the blanks. The blanks are problems. Certainly, there's a usability issue? Yes, we can correct that with the clerical things.
Yeah, I can jump in, Andrew. From the code officer perspective, I mean, some of it is tied to definition and use. It would be pretty exhaustive to go through each of those things versus just taking the use, going through the whole table. And I mean, it's a good exercise to align what uses we have to how, I guess, the profession or the field is kind of moving towards categorizing uses. Don, you're familiar with this one, fast food restaurants in every zone. The way it's defined is extremely confusing to the code officer. Might make sense to some folks. It's conditional in every zone. I mean, one of the things that we can do with this, in my opinion, is align better uses to the impacts they may have and where they should and should not be allowed. I think we've done that with the current use table, so it makes our job easy when we just basically recategorize. I mean, it's not, at the end of the day, I don't think we would change where things are permitted or not permitted or anything like that. It's more of
so is this whole process editorial, or would it end up going to the town meeting?
No, it would go to town meeting, because I think what we want to do is remove and perhaps redefine some of those items. fast food. I mean, we added in the things since I've been here, and I kind of thought it was just a matter of practice, adding uses to things that we anticipate coming in. Maine Harvest was coming to town. We created a food processing use. It really makes no sense. It's light manufacturing. I mean, it's the same thing, except it's food. I don't know if you recall that one, Dawn, but there's a few of those that I have seen happen over the past 10 years that it's in my opinion not a good practice versus having a table that you align uses with that are in some sort of category. So if it's residential, does it fit in residential? If it's retail or consumer goods, where does it go there? Is it service? Is it, we've been our use table doesn't flow in any manner that is categorized at all. So that's editorial in my mind. I think if we embark on the path, then it's going to get outside of editorial. The big thing that would trigger the town meeting vote would be filling in the blanks. Where we've created uses, here's another one. I mean, batch plant, we created a use to satisfy Harold Sandelin. I mean, it's obviously heavy industrial, and why bother having a micro use, in my opinion, when it's you allow it or you don't allow it in a certain zone, and focusing in on what landowner, what that person does, and then defining it and putting it in our use table is a mistake, in my opinion.
Okay, what's the rest of the board have to say? Any Dan, you're unmuted. Do you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I do like the reorganization, the editorial presentation here. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it looks nice. It's easy. It's nice and organized. I generally like the approach. I would like to see, some examples of these catch-all definitions for each one of those subcategories. But overall, I do like the format that's presented here.
I would say that those catch-all categories, the addition of definitions there, and the identification of where those are permissible would also require a town meeting action. So that would be one component there. That's not explicitly just a kind of clerical type of thing.
All right, Bruce, did you have something?
Just that I agree with Rod. The categories, changing the use table every time an individual owner has a specific need doesn't make sense. You have broader categories, makes it more flexible into the future. So I like that. Whether we're ready, for all that to get to town meeting, that's a different thing. But in terms of general direction, I agree.
Okay. Other comments? If not, you guys heard what's said. Let's go ahead and give it a shot.
Yeah. Just another one here, Don. I agree. I think it's a good thing to do. I think, when we go to, obviously Bruce alluded to it, it's going to take a little bit of effort here, especially when we start taking these catch-all uses and, finalizing where those are allowed. I assume it's going to be a subset of the specific uses that are under that same kind of level of the title, but it'd be something we'd have to determine. But at the same token, one thing I liked with the Peoria table is, they've got, their blank is not permitted, but whatever. They have permitted, not permitted. And then I'd like to know kind of what, and this gets on to our conditional discussion later, what their definition is of subject to special use or review.
Good question. I was going to ask that.
Because it seems, at least from the verbiage, it sounds like it might have some details. It sounds a lot better than subject to conditional review. I know we've kind of separated the two processes here for this time. We started discussing conditional use as potentially including revisiting that use and whether we even have it. But maybe this Peoria table approach is something that provides some good input. I don't know. Do you have the details on that, Andrew or Rod?
Yeah, we can get those for sure. And to kind of piggyback on what you and Bruce just brought up, I mean, as far as May town meeting, that's a nice goal to have for any amendment we're trying to accomplish at this point in the calendar. But, you know, there's no race here at all. I mean, this is, if in fact we really take the time to review this stuff and have long, lengthy discussions and come to consensus as a planning board on this. I mean, this is could potentially be a real amendment versus just an exercise, an editorial exercise.
Yeah.
Which probably won't make May town meeting, but who knows when that town meeting will be.
And to add some not confusion, but additional conversation at least, you know, we're likely to start some amount of a zoning rewrite process in the next year or two. You know, really to try and implement the comprehensive plan. That would be a pretty substantial rewrite of the existing code. The use table would be addressed at that point in time too. So, you know, we can make some baby steps now perhaps, and then that sets the ground for a bigger effort, you know, as a part of that overarching rewrite.
And I'll just mention that I think if the planning board wants to be the ones carrying the water for the use table that we develop with you folks would translate well into a zoning code rewrite.
Okay. So let's proceed.
Wait, I just have one question, if I may, Don.
Yeah, one thing, Larry, first before I forget it.
Yeah.
You mentioned comprehensive review. I know I'm not sure where we're at, but I know we stood up the implementation committee. At some point, it would be good, even if it's just to introduce the players to the planning board. And I guess I'd ask if they could sort of just give us a briefing on what process they're going to be putting in place and so forth. And then obviously, I'm assuming we're going to do joint workshops at some point as they come through, doing some of what they're going to be developing, similar to what we did the last time around. But go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I just had one question, Andrew. In the last pages of your memo, I'm assuming that is our current use table.
All right. I didn't print out the entirety of my memo. I just put out the part I wrote. So hang on.
It's not fully filled in, Larry. There's all that yellow space, Andrew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That's where I'm just continuing to put in the uses.
He's making a new spreadsheet, Larry, so that we can manage it better.
I'm literally moving P's and C's and X's over left and right. So.
Okay. Well, one of the P's that is there, which should not be there, is a batch plant being a P in the RCU.
Okay.
That did not pass at town meeting.
Understood. Yeah. I have a strategy here where I'm finishing up this table, and then Irene is going through and matching up the old table to the new table to make sure that we have no translation errors. That's a big anxiety of mine, very large anxiety. I don't want to.
I think Andrew started with Carol's previous table that she brought to the planning board a few years back. Is that correct, Andrew?
Yeah.
Or that would have been a P. That makes sense to me.
I
Don, I'll address, the CPIC was here last meeting.
Oh, sorry.
They did have a little introduction with the planning board. It's a good point you bring up. They did talk about, you know, you guys are partners, essentially. You'll be seeing a lot of them, in other words.
Okay, good. All right.
Hey, Don, I just have one thing.
Yeah.
Just going back to that, the use table that has the highlights on it. You know, I also like the fact that where the zoning districts go across on the row, those have been kind of shuffled around to be better organized. You have your residential and your mixed use followed by your business park and so forth. I think that makes sense as well.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Any other comments on this item? All right. So what's the next one, Andrew or Rod?
Conditional uses.
So
So
you
I think
did
we need a
discuss
little
it
more
last.
direction. I sat down a couple weeks ago to try and make some changes here, and then I realized, what's the goal here? Is it to clarify the existing standards? Is it to modify the standards to reduce? I'm unclear about the goal when it comes to looking at conditional use standards, and figuring out what the improvement is. So I need a little more direction. I posed a couple of questions at the end of the memo to try and get some thoughts from this meeting. We talk a lot about adverse impact, compatibility, and I think that's what kind of raised anxiety, kind of the subjective nature of a conditional use permit. Those are terms that we can either try to define what it means to have an adverse impact or to be compatible with, or we can try and eliminate them altogether. The text of the memo kind of says, in short, most communities have some form of a conditional use. It's a maybe category. It's one in which we're saying, hey, we think it's probably permissible here, but the planning board wants to look at it to make sure it's going to fit, and that we have another opportunity to put conditions on a project to make sure that it's going to fit into the zone. One of the hangups with the Aroma Joe's project was the comprehensive plan, and the fact that one of our conditional use standards relates to the long range plan and the vision. And that vision is a very kind of subjective, ephemeral thing that, they aren't black and white, metrics that you can measure a project against. And that makes that subjective idea even harder to kind of wrap your head around. Is it important for us to consider long range plans as a part of conditional uses or not? That would be a helpful outcome from tonight's meeting to help kind of orient at least myself towards what these changes are to be.
So a couple of very quick comments. One is, and I call it the cell tower war. But I mean, we went through that same angst, if you will, in all of the meetings we had in regards to that. And in particular, as you said, it got into such a subjective interpretation. At one point, at least a couple of the attorneys involved talked about how our conditional use, the way it was written, certainly left us up to some level of allowing for appeals and so forth. But I'm not sure anyone really had a better conditional use or special permit or whatever it was called in any of the other locations. And frankly, at least at one point, what we talked about was that we were going to, once we got through that whole cell tower thing, go back and redo the ordinance, right? But then after that whole thing evolved, and there was where they took, the cell tower company took the town to court and everything else, basically the town attorney suggested we just leave things alone, right? And so I sort of teed off of a couple of Scott's comments in the Aroma Joe discussion, which just sort of reminded me of the same thing we ran into with conditional use with the cell tower. So I think it probably does warrant some level of effort to go back and review it and see, are there ways to maybe eliminate some of the subjectivity and make it more objective? But that's just my thought. I guess, Bruce, you've unmuted. I'll let you go. But I think, Scott, again, you had, I thought, some very valid comments during that Aroma Joe discussion in regards to conditional use. So why don't you go first, Bruce?
Well, thanks. Just remind me of the standards again. I wrote it. It's compatibility with the general neighborhood and consistency with the comprehensive plan. Is that, or am I mixing the verbs and nouns that, the standards? But those are the ones, those two are the ones that.
No adverse impacts to the traffic system.
Well, the adverse impact one, you add the word significant under adverse impact and I'm done. You know, because no adverse impact,
Yeah.
I run into that same thing in NEPA where they have adverse impact. Oh, do you have an impact? And you go, oh, yes, but it's not a significant impact. And therefore you don't need to get a permit, you know, to say if it's a significant impact. Significant is always going to be, significant and adverse are always going to be, can be argued over, but that's exactly what we're kind of here to do. People come up and they testify and they go, this is significant, this is adverse. And then we listen and kind of go, yes or no. And so I don't think you can find those any better. But it's what is the phrase related to the comprehensive plan in our?
Sure. Let's see here. All right, the use is compatible with the comprehensive plan and the anticipated future development of the neighborhood. And I would argue just in and of itself, that's two separate standards. Those are two
That's
separate.
correct. So there aren't two separate ones? And it's,
No, that's all one single.
Okay, well, there you go. Those are two very different things.
Mhm.
One is I do have and I will, you know, already yielding my time to Scott for the rebuttal on comprehensive plans. The idea that you can say something is compatible with a comprehensive plan when, look at, we just heard from the consultant working for Crooker, right? Go, here's the list of all things that says it's consistent. And then you go, sorry, compatible, that's the word. And then you have this list of things over here. You can always find it in everyone. And I don't feel comprehensive plans are actionable documents. They are not actionable documents. That's why they go through a process of having zoning after when you have those. There's statements of visions, then statements of rules and regs. So I have a problem with, you know, making that judgment. And I believe going back to the water tower, I know the lawyers were starting to talk about unconstitutionally vague. That's an unconstitutionally vague standard is what they were starting on. I kind of like that we didn't cave then, Don, because, you know, you never let them lawyer up and push you around. But, you know, that was actually real, you know, that's a real standard that they have in the common law. So compatibility with the, you know, general surroundings in the neighborhood, that's a standard that we could be, that's a finding of fact that we could say, I mean, that we as a board could do. So that's different to me. So compatible with the surrounding neighborhood, and compatible is different than consistent.
Mhm.
So that's why I asked. I always thought, and maybe it's because I've been reading other regulatory rules, that it was consistent with the plan and compatible with the neighborhood, but it's compatible with both.
The use is compatible with the comprehensive plan and the anticipated future development of the neighborhood.
The anticipated future development of the neighborhood. So we sit here and go, Karnak, I think this neighborhood is going in this direction. And that is consistent with that. I don't think that's a definition problem, compatible, compounded by what you're comparing it to, the future development of the neighborhood. So generally compatible with the existing neighborhood or the zone of the neighborhood. That's something I think we can work with and make the findings of fact.
It's that future thing, right?
In the future and the vision, that's the place where I have a problem.
Okay.
So that's where I am. So I would change it, but I don't think it would be wholesale. You know, I think it would be compatible with the generally compatible with the uses allowed in the zone or the neighborhood, you know, that kind of thing. Comprehensive plans, I think are too aspirational and visionary to be regulatory, is my personal opinion, but that's all it is. And when I didn't like, the major reason I want to work on this is I disagreed with Scott for the first time on the planning board for like ever. And I didn't like it. So That's one of the reasons. I figure it must not be me, right? It has to be the ordinance, so.
There you go. All right,
But I
Scott.
mean, I agree with you, Bruce, on as far as the conditional use as being that part of it being vague. I mean, but it was in there, and my since it's in there on Maroma Joe's, mine was that it wasn't compatible with the comprehensive plan. So I don't disagree that is a wishy-washy way to have it in there. And I think that the second part of that part about the us trying to see what the vision is, I think that really refers back to the plan too, as far as what the vision is outlined in the plan. But still, it doesn't make it any more real, as far as forecasting 2 inches of snow tomorrow and getting 15. But
Yeah.
it's something to change. I still get back to what I mentioned earlier on the use table. I mean, a lot of this stems from the fact, I think, that conditional uses were thrown out and added to this use table at times after comp plans came into being and uses got, the various zones got changed and the use table got cobbled together. Auto sales, Middle Village, in Village Center, they're there. But at some point along the line, they became conditional. And part of the reason they became conditional, I think, I don't have all the comp plans in front of me to look at, were that was the vision, not to have, to move them over to 196. And
It was.
no one at the time, we didn't want to say, or whoever was doing the work didn't want to say that they're no longer permitted, because then they're grandfathered in, and then you're having these huge issues with non-compatible use where they are. So, oh yeah, let's make them conditional. Well, now we have the conditional use standard. Well, geez, what's the problem with putting an auto dealer in? We've got 2 of them already. Let's throw a third. So it kind of, it's a cyclical argument that doesn't apply to the plan, and it makes it the zoning ordinance kind of not lining up with what we think we're trying to do. And that goes back to thinking, if we do take this use table up into initially, I think I like stage 1A of reorganizing and coming up with these various subject headings, and even these catch-alls to apply that at one time. Then maybe next, working with CPIC and others, coming up with, maybe it's time to just bite the bullet on some of these issues. When we did neighborhood grocery stores, we we made it conditional, but I think we took a hard look at that as far as, this is conditional in a residential area, and we provided some pretty clear standards on how to do that. So in that case, it seems like conditional maybe is useful to have, but in others, it just seems like it's just a cover our ass type thing.
It's a kicking of the can.
Yeah.
It's the political expedient way to get a use identified in the table. I mean, the auto dealer in Village Center was prohibited to begin with, and that blew up. So it became conditional.
Right, and I guess that's my very point, is that I agree with everything you said, Scott, that the comprehensive plan was saying no auto dealerships. The elected officials could not go there, or, it blew up. So where we actually got was auto dealers are still can be there. And then once auto dealers are there, they're there. And that's I guess one thing that could help me, and you started this whole thing by saying conditional uses are kind of like uses that we think are okay, but just if you do a little bit more. I actually kind of looked at it as, no, they're uses that aren't okay unless you do, all this other stuff. And it's that gray area. The gray in general doesn't work. I think you had an example. For me, I like either, because I'm looking at from someone who used to represent applicants and be applicants, and you're coming forward and just, what can I do, what I can't do. And then, okay, this is one that I can do if I spend more soft costs up front and get more studies. I do more traffic studies, I do more that, and that's okay. You know, that the applicant must prove through traffic studies such and such. Applicant must prove through noise studies such and such. That's okay, you set out the rules. In general, we're not going there until you show us more stuff. I think that's
Oh.
okay. Because
And
it's,
then Bruce, to whittle that down, your findings of fact and your vote on the permit then regulates the actual standards. If the zoning lacks the standards to regulate noise, trap, blah, blah, blah.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So,
And Bruce, I completely agree with that. My take on it is that we often consider conditional use. Maybe it's just because I lose these battles. That we seem to.
Scott, you don't lose all the time. Now, come on.
No, but we seem to, in my view, it seems to be that kind of conditional has, yeah, they have some hurdles to make, but yeah, it's doable. I think we need to make those hurdles more concrete, more defined, and more protective of the zone to potential projects that really should not be permitted.
So
if that's where we're going with it, great.
So what your suggestion is we should take a look at the current conditional use ordinance and look at some of the language. Right. And then I think on top of that, at some point, and it sounded like you guys moved away from it at the last meeting, but at some point we need to look at all the items we have conditional use in the table and say, does that still make sense? And that is a bigger nut, but I think that's kind of what I'm thinking. But again, where does the board want to go?
well,
Well, Andrew did provide a lot of language from other places that I think if you folks give us some guidance on what you may think could be applicable, because some of them are good, I would call them fairly decent metrics into decision-making on it's a site plan, you're doing a review of a proposal.
There was one that I read in which the conditional use standard related to traffic it wasn't just adverse impact or negative impact, it was shall not decrease the level of service below level C or D or whatever it was, very objective measures. Bruce is saying that's too specific, too objective.
no, I'm saying at the very last, at the Aroma Joe's one, we had two different traffic engineers saying two different things.
Yeah.
Traffic engineering is the dark arts of engineering. I mean,
Oh, that's stormwater, Bruce.
Maybe it's just engineering altogether.
Oh,
No, it's not.
No.
It's rare. It's rare, but traffic engineering is the Jedi mind trick. This isn't the impact you're looking for. It's just, that kind of stuff. And I had to get very specific with one of the traffic engineers saying, did you talk to so-and-so about such and such, and did they make a finding?
Mm-hmm.
No, that I never talked to them. Well, okay. Then that's when I considered it premature, and I thought they should do their homework and come back, but they were ready to go forward, and work after. So I think this is, what about form-based codes? We never doing that, Is that not going to happen? Because if that happens, all this is Katie by the door. It's just like.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, uses don't go away with form-based. So that's something.
Why not?
I'll give you the 2-second update there. Okay.
Okay.
The CPIC came, that's something that they're going
Yes,
on
no,
Thursday night to update the select board. Had an RFP, 18-month-long process to essentially do two things, do the analysis and come up with a proposal for some form-based coding, but also during that whole time, educate everybody in the town about what the hell it is. It's a new form of zoning. And everybody you ask, what is form-based, everybody has a bit of a different answer.
Well, tell me what it is again.
It's what we decided is when we go through the process, but essentially it's more It's not a use-based code. It's not, you're less concerned with the use, but there's still prohibited uses. And we could decide there's still conditional uses. I mean, it's really based on we're not Somerville, Mass. We're not Scarborough, Maine. We're Topsham, and you folks are going to decide that as a community.
Things like form-based codes are like, you got 35 feet of height here, and you got to have a certain set.
It's form. Okay, we don't care you're selling donuts or trinkets or antiques.
Or you have an apartment house.
Or you're living there. It's
Or-
basically allowing all the uses within the form, so to speak.
The form, but you still have dimensional requirements based on the
Correct.
use, and you still have it's a longer chat than my 2 seconds are up, I think, but we can send along some info.
No, it's just my point is the resolution of that question, which is complex, which, by the way, the town of Topsham after 18 months isn't going to be ready to do something like that. Oh my God, their mind will explode. We need a use table that they can read, that kind of stuff. In my humble opinion, having worked on things like charter commissions and stuff like that in the past, and it's just like, no.
Yeah, that's already blown up. Yeah,
That's a big threat.
So some towns have done hybrid coding, but one thing with form-based, Bruce, that I've seen is what this Peoria table is. It's special use. They don't call it conditional. And they tweak it a different way. It's new language. It's different, but essentially the same thing, without the vagueness, I guess.
I guess Scott drew a very legitimate connection by the use table and compatible, our conditional use. And I'm just saying, yes, there's one there, and yes, there's one depending on whether you go on a form-based code, and yes,
Right. No, you're right. Actually, that's true.
And so I'm on the conditional uses where I think we still are on the charts and that kind of in the use table. I mean, clean it up, but I got to tell you, I always have this weird kind of personal rule that I try and make to no life decisions in late March. You know what I mean? That's cabin fever time, and you're waiting for the snow to melt and you're going a little crazy. That's not the time to change jobs or buy a house or all those kind of things. Wait till April. Well, we're kind of in March of the coronavirus, right? I mean, we got a ways to go here. Where I just don't know how much, with all the moving parts, we should be trying to make major policy pronouncements when I can't even. I mean, I can tell you, this is not my format for figuring shit out. This just is not. I like to, I used to when I used to be able to sit next to Scott, I'd write something and hand it to him, and he'd cross it and back, and that's how I like to solve problems. And on this, we can't even.
Well, Bruce, you're bringing something up pretty good.
Big, huge movement is kind of where I am, and not because they aren't all valid, and not because we shouldn't be doing them. It's just a case of they're all moving at one time.
Well, and I would to piggyback what you're saying. Sorry to interrupt, but I think as we're having this discussion, what's going through my head is process, and Maytown meeting is whatever. We don't need to chat about May being a timeline. But what we should chat about, say you're going to embark on a use table or even conditional use, farming out some tasks for other committees, CPIC, conservation, TDI, whoever, to go through and give their input, do the checklist. Why is that permitted? Get the input, regurgitate it yourselves, digest it, what have you, and really go through a community process, not only because you want the input, but because you want other folks to have some ownership versus you guys. And even the Board of Selectmen, give us some input on the uses here. This isn't a vacuum. In the past, planning board, you guys would just do amendments, hold your public hearings, go to town meeting, and in some cases get pissed off when everybody goes, what the hell is this? It's the first time I'm seeing this ordinance amendment. And it's hard. I mean, having that public process is difficult, but it's a lot easier if you're actually tasking existing committees.
Yeah, but I think a couple of things, and one is that some of those comments have always been, in my opinion, at least I'll say it in a nice way, uninformed, right? It's like the person on the finance committee sitting there saying, well, how did this even get here, right? When that person could have sat through all the workshops and or the public hearings and even the public hearing with the select board before it even went on the warrant, acting like it was just something that just came out of nowhere. And then the other thing is usually the ones that we've had that people have not wanted to approve at town meeting have been, related to very specific items like the electronic signs and that type of stuff, right? But that all being said, I get it, right? Because most people don't really follow the planning board to any great extent until it comes around and it affects them, right? So, but I guess I do think that we've talked about conditional use for years and years and years. And every time we approach it, we sort of back away from it. And I'm not saying that we have to jump into it, Bruce, because it's March of COVID. I get it, right? But, and I agree with you. This is a really tough format to do workshops, in my opinion.
I could write a word revision. So I almost half dictated one tonight of the kind of things. Add the word significant, delete the reference to the comprehensive plan. That's okay. I could clearly set forth Bruce Van Note's vision of conditional use permit, but I don't know if that's right. I'm not going to feel comfortable going to anyone until most of the people on this board read it and go, okay, what do you think?
All right, and I agree. And the other thing is that I don't disagree with tasking things out, Rod. I think we need to have a better kind of consensus of what we think we want to actually have tasked, right? And I'm not sure we're there, right?
Oh, absolutely. No, you're right.
So
well, in the mode of Andrew's asking questions, how many people want to find something compatible with something that's going to happen in the future? Because that's what we have today. That's what we have today.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on that, I listened to Scott and Bruce and Don, and I would agree with both. I think my viewpoint of the issue on conditional use is probably almost exactly what Bruce said. So he basically gave you a fantastic lesson on the wording of conditional use and why it's a problem. And I can't add anything to that. I would agree that trying to say that conditional use is based on compatibility with the comprehensive plan doesn't really work. And trying to figure out where the neighborhood's going to be at some point down the road in the future is hard to determine facts based on that requirement. So I would want to get rid of both of those things. I don't really care about the format. I think this is just definitely more difficult to do this type of workshop this way. But I think we can get something done. We don't have to get anything to the point where it needs to be approved, but we can make some progress, some forward progress. And if we adjust to the conditional use language as Bruce suggested, I think that'd be a positive step forward. But before, I may be wrong about this, but to Bruce's point about the ordinance being actionable and the comprehensive plan not being so, that was always my understanding. And so my question for Rod is, do you know whether or not the intent of the language in the conditional use provision was to say, hey, we know that the comprehensive plan is not really supposed to be actionable, but if we embed it in the conditional use, then perhaps we get the ordinance to have to comply with the plan somehow. And I just don't think that's how it's supposed to work under the law, but I'm foggy on that at this point.
I don't really have a good answer for you, Josh, on that. I will say comprehensive plans do have some teeth, especially when they have specific zoning implementation language, like the R2 zone setback should be 40 feet from the front, 20 feet from the side. And if a town doesn't implement that through zoning, then the town is on the hook for not doing its job of making the zoning consistent with the comprehensive plan. That's why most towns don't get their comprehensive plans that specific.
With who?
But I would say, if you've read some of our what I would call, they're almost a bit more like strategic plans. Like the 196 corridor plan has a bit more specificity, where you folks just implemented the R2B zone on Route 196. And it was a cut and paste from that plan, and you brought it to town meeting. Same with the Main Street stuff, and obviously some of those things that we just identified didn't get enacted the way the plan had envisioned. It's messy. I don't know what to tell you. And my belief of conditional use, I wasn't here when this was written, the standards we have now. But I said earlier, it's kicking the can. It's a committee that kicks the can, either the planning board or somebody that's like, I don't know whether we call this permitted or not permitted, but if we make it conditional, then we'll make a decision when we see what comes in. I don't have a real good specific answer.
I can tell you that an applicant considers conditional a matter of right as long as you go through the process. It's a conditional use, but all I have to do is satisfy conditions and I get this use.
Mm-hmm.
So the name insinuates that. So
I mean, there's a big
I
if
think there
there, though.
less conditional use, but as a proposal to move forward with all these various things, I would suggest that just kind of doing the non-town meeting use table reformatting would be a smart thing to do.
Mhm.
Just because then you have a nice format for when, broader questions, the zoning comes and that and it's just something that, it's great for Tom and applicants and the public. They just can see exactly what's going on. And I think I would be okay trying to make a revision to the conditional use words. It would be a half a page document. It would just be a track changes, half a page document. If we all can agree on it. I'd be glad to work with Andrew and write one. In fact, I'm pretty sure Andrew could write one based on the conversation we just had.
I took very good notes, Bruce.
Yeah. And that would be, but again, I'm just doing that because that's the thing that I had always wished as I'm sitting here taking the vote that it said. Boy, it doesn't say that though. It says, and admittedly, Scott, I would sit there going, am I really going to, on a regulatory basis, find something is compatible or incompatible with a use in the future? And I go, in general, I can't bring myself to do that. I understand why you did and I respect it. But in general, I just go, oh, please. And I think of myself back in the cell tower days, before they stood up there and lawyered up and said unconstitutionally vague. I'm sitting there in my law school class going, unconstitutionally vague. What the heck is this? This is not good. So, but we can eliminate that kind of that vagueness. And in general, going towards what the applicant has to show, what the impacts, the measurable impacts and the seriousness and those kinds of things, as opposed to a vague standard to something that doesn't exist yet. So I think we could do something that changes that if the board agrees. That's where I am. And that would be actually something we could do for this town meeting, I think. It'd be one document, we'd do that. And then all the rest of the stuff happens. All the rest of the stuff happens. So that would be something that I would propose. No skin off my nose if the board doesn't think so, or thinks it should be linked to the use table or all that other stuff for the March in COVID reason that I said before. But that one's bite size. It's a document. We can all read it and see if we're okay with it.
So I'm okay with that. What about the rest of the board? Any objection?
No,
Scott?
Works for me. I mean, I think it's our good first step and we're moving in the right direction. Maybe when we get that reformatted land use table to look at, maybe we get closer to April or May at that point, figuratively and maybe literally. And we can say, okay, well, maybe we can bite off those blanks. And maybe there are some low-hanging conditional use that can be either made permitted or not permitted to not get, certainly getting at all of them, if we're, really trying to get at that, that's something that is beyond what we can do right now, and maybe beyond what we want to do. But
Okay.
I think that's the first step, and maybe we can take smaller steps afterwards at this time.
Yeah, and Don, I would agree with Scott. I did take some time to look through, the standards that Andrew provided for the other towns like Saco and Augusta, Old Town and Bangor. Obviously, the conditional use policy that we have in Topsham is not unique. Looking at some of these other standards, they're just as subjective as some of ours are. There's different levels of detail and so forth. So I certainly think there's an opportunity to take a look at a few of these and see if, like you said with Bruce, if we could get a little bit more specific and eliminate some of the gray area. But I think inherently, there's going to be some subjectivity when you're talking about conditional uses. You're trying to say, okay, a certain use might fit in a certain part of an existing zone, like closer to 196 versus another part of that zone where there could be higher traffic impact. So there's inherently a place for it, I think, but there's certainly some opportunity there to look at some of the language, I think.
Okay, good. All right, Rod and Andrew, let's move on to the last topic then. Waiver standards.
I'll be speaking on that one. I'm going to share my screen because Dan sent, see if this is the right one. No, it's not. Let's see. Hold on, bear with me. So hopefully you guys read through the waiver standard memo. Getting to our conversation, trying to make this more simple than more complicated. And in discussing with the code officer, I'm gonna try to keep it more simple. So these are just some questions that were posed, and I'll just start in on what I've proposed here. It's essentially keeping and piggybacking from the last discussion. So the last meeting, you kind of gave some guidance on what we should do here. We have waivers that are found in Chapter 185, 175, 191, and 225.27, which is the parking standards. So the planning board, when there's a waiver request, and so the first question that Dan asks, and I put in here, I'll be seeking guidance from the code officer in regard to Chapter 225, because we have performance standards embedded in 225. They are not waivable via site plan from the planning board, unless explicitly waivable in Chapter 225. At this point, I don't want to touch that. That's a bigger task than going through each of those specific standards. So it's really the things that you folks review and apply standards to that you have the ability to waive those standards, then we will seek to keep these there. So for instance, if we want to just have uniform language and identify it in each chapter, so Chapter 185, if we want to amend the waiver provisions that to make it uniform with Chapter 175 waiver provisions, we'll just consistently make those amendments. In this, I threw in a purpose. Just one of the things I'm trying to do whenever we do ordinance amendments is get back to what is the purpose? What are we doing this for? It's not needed, but for and for anybody reading the ordinance, why is this ordinance here? Hopefully it answers the question. I find them to be helpful when you have a performance standard and you want to, hopefully most of our newer amendments have the purpose of that standard being coded.
Can you scroll down a little bit? Trying to,
Yeah.
Yeah, please do. I just tried to scroll on my iPad and it didn't work.
right, because he has the power.
He
right
has
now.
the power. Exactly.
Yeah.
Can you folks see it?
See,
So
see,
some of these
to me
edits-
that I like the purpose, because I think there's always a question, is the waiver, do we do waivers because of the context, you know, and the land use and those kind of thing, which the purpose says yes? Or is it because the applicant needs it? Is it due to the unique circumstances of this applicant or the unique circumstances of this property? And I think it's generally property is why the waivers are there. But even in this, you say will not exact undue hardship because of the peculiar conditions pertaining to the property, not to the applicant, but to the property in question. And a lot of other waiver type things talk about undue hardship on the landowners. I mean, that's not, I mean, those are more in for, you know, the zoning board. Those are more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Variance, perhaps.
Thank you very much. That's exactly the word I'm looking for. Undue hardship. There's 4 criteria. They're statutory, you know, and those are very hard to meet, by the way, if taken literally. Yeah, the variance standards are almost impossible to meet, taking word for word literally. But so if your basic idea here, Rod, is to make sure every time we talk for a waiver, we use the same language, so we can just kind of default into our waiver standards in our head. I think that's a good, that's a good, at least interim step. Again, I always prefer to get as much black and white as we can on these things, but it's never going to be entirely, and you're going to have to take cases. And if there's a particular property that requires waivers, either because it's already forested or it's not, or there's no way, or, you know, I always feel funny doing buffer zones in the middle of a farm field, you know, that kind of thing, when no one else has them for miles around. But again, it's about the property, and we have standards. So if the standards are different, you want to make them all uniform, that sounds smart to me.
Yeah, I guess I would ask that, so you folks know this, but the underline is the new language that is kind of piecemeal together. I think it's based on the last meeting and bringing forth some more, I guess, bulk to the waiver standards. And the other piece to this is aligning the applicant, the whole process of requesting a waiver. You know, when I arrived in Topsham, it was just, hey, by the way, we want a waiver of this standard, without much in the way of review standards. And I think we're just becoming a little more formal with these are the check boxes you need to go through. These would be added check boxes we're proposing here. So if you have guidance on the new language and any of the edits that you see here, I guess my proposal to you folks would be that this is cut and pasted in the sections where you're allowed to grant waivers. And we'll step through that as well.
I can't see everybody, Rod. So anybody have any comment? Okay, I guess not. I think that's fine, like Bruce said, right? Especially if we are trying to make them more consistent throughout the areas where we are allowed to do that, right? It would make a lot of sense.
And I like the process additions, Rod. I mean, just, you're asking for a waiver, here's the thing, and planning staff has already chewed on it. So I don't have to look up at the podium. I can look at you, Rod, and go, hey. Sorry, Andrew. Hey, have they gone through this process? And
I see. I thought you were saying the decision making looking toward the
No,
planners.
no,
review.
just sit there. Have they filled out the thing and said that, you know,
Right.
and you have a professional opinion staff that this is the minimal acceptable waiver necessary to have a practical use? Yes, we do. Oh, thank you. Okay, finding a fact. We're good to go.
Right.
Agreed.
All right. Let's move on
How
with that
about
one.
Josh? Josh, do you have some comments for us?
Rod, why would you call me out specifically for comments?
then.
Well, actually, because this is here for you. I'm doing this all for you, Josh.
Don was gonna skip right over me, which is okay with me, but yeah, I guess I think I raised this question. You were looking for issues that may need cleaning up in the code, and I mentioned I get frustrated when I have to look at different waiver standards and different provisions. So I like the direction we're going here, getting them on one location. So
Okay, awesome.
make the efforts, and it's good
Yep.
progress.
Great, thanks.
There you go. All right.
Definitely.
Any other comments on that? And I guess Rod and Andrew, anything else for the board before we break?
Anticipated upcoming reviews if they submit in time.
Yeah, we have Fairview Commons, which is the other half of Topsham Crossing. I think you guys approved the preliminary plan and then tabled the site plan, the final plan, plus the site plan, plus the SLOTA. May be coming at the end of January. It may not be till the beginning of February. And then Mallet Woods phases 3 and 4 for a final plan. Again, probably the beginning of February is my guess. But other than that, not a ton. So
I'll just interject the Fairview. They're moving along, but the time constraint for them is getting their materials in for SLOTA review and not getting some of the right things in. We are doing that with delegated review. There's been a lot of back and forth on what's needed for the review and a lot of time lapse in the holidays, I suppose, but just to let you know that that's moving. It's just taking its time.
So what do we have for the, what is that, the 19th?
These are both maybes for the 19th.
Okay.
Is that right, Andrew?
yes, though
Although
I would say
Mallet
Fairview
Woods
Commons is the one that's the maybe, and Mallet Woods is way. I mean,
Yeah, that's
they're updating traffic study. They were going to have some amount of environmental permitting that they have to update as well. So that kind of got pushed out a little bit, in my opinion.
Okay.
So it's
But-
probably
But
Fairview.
Chris might bring it anyway.
Yes, he will.
You know, Chris.
That's good, Scott. Yes.
Maybe we can have
And then
the-
I'll
the
just have to do
waiver,
that. It's not cooked
language
yet.
set
Go
up
home.
For that same
Right.
meeting.
Yeah. All right,
Yeah,
guys. Hey, anything
Mr.
else?
Chairman, just Andrew, I'd be glad to look at a conditional use thing, but just know that state budget's due Friday, the bonds due the week after that. Next couple weeks, you could send me the Magna Carta and I wouldn't find time to read it. So just, but if you go ahead and send it in an inbox, I'd be glad to look at it. And I'm literally thinking it's this long.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very narrow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So the plan would be in 2 weeks, we meet again for Fairview Commons. Okay. All right, good. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.